So let me just start with a question. Ed, you talked about how technology enables, but it doesn't require. What are the sort of golden rules that we would not want technology to to force us to abandon? Are there? And John, you talked about them as sort of human golden rule kind of rules. What are the 2 or 3 big things that we want to make sure we're not pushed into doing? Are there any?
Well, I'm bridling a little bit at the question because I'd rather not dwell on the possibilities of technology inducing us to do evil. I think that technology challenges us to redefine and reaffirm sort of the core to the practice of journalism. And how does journalism differ from other modes that have evolved to talk about what's happening around us? Or does it differ? Does journalism exist as a separate kind of discourse, a separate social practice? And I think it does. I think at the extremes, we know journalism is different from propaganda, because propaganda makes a corrupt use of fact. We know it's different from gossip, because gossip makes an inadequate effort to determine what fact is. And we know that journalism has a core public service motivation. At least I think we know that. So the question is, how do you, and I think Jane's critique was really very interesting, and I think that I strongly agree with the notion of ethics being kind of trotted out, being hauled out as a set of prohibitions. And I think John's point also, he was reacting to the notion that ethical conduct consists of a sort of random application of mindless rules, or mindless, or sort of a brainless sort of deference to law, when in fact ethics is in the business of telling law what it ought to be. So I'm dancing around your question a little bit because I would rather not be sort of Dr. No and look at the ways that ethics should be resisting change, when in fact one of the points I was trying to make is that ethical practice in journalism requires us to embrace these new tools because they're far more effective and far more compelling ways to tell the kind of, to share the truths about significant realities around us. That is the core of the journalism practice.
Better answer than question, although Dr. No's gotten cool again, apparently.
Always was cool.
John, you at Gawker, you were in the business of traveling in gossip and rumor, right? So how does that square with this notion that we should take some responsibility for what it is that we pass along, about whether it's true or not?
Well, I mean, we tried to I guess the goal at Gawker was honesty, as perhaps distinct from accuracy. So, and mostly that was a function of the fact that a lot of the stuff that we were doing, if we had an exclusive thing, if we had something that came into us, we would do, we reported it out. We wouldn't just like throw tips up on the internet. Sometimes we might as a blind item, but we would, because it's more valuable to us if we can nail it down, and it's a better story, and we want to, the goal is good stories. But when we were addressing things that were out there, that are on the internet, that people are already talking about, part of our job is to address what's already sort of been disclosed. And again, like I was saying, that a lot of the sort of those sort of process and ethical questions would come up, like, well, do we address this or not? And at the end of the day, the key value for us was to do it honestly. I don't know if it's true or not, but enough people are talking about it that you've probably already heard about it. Here are the efforts that we've undertaken to find out if it is true or not. But that was a function of the fact that it's such a leaky environment. There's so much data out there careening around the internet, and when one of your jobs is to present what the news is on the internet, you have to find ways to do that. And I don't see anything particularly troublesome about, or troubling about reporting things that people are talking about, and reporting them in an honest way, saying what we know, what we don't know. These are the efforts we've taken to assess it, and this is what's out there. And it's always a case by case basis. It's situational. But does this story merit something? Does it not merit something? And that's how we would approach it.
So, but then it's not a self-cleaning oven. You're actually going in and saying, well, we want to scrub on this one. we need to do some.
Right. I mean, depending on the story, and if it was an exclusive thing, like we wouldn't want to be the only people reporting something if we didn't have it, nailed down to our satisfaction. But it is, if there's a story, I'm trying to think of a good example. Nothing's really coming to mind, but if there's a story that people are out there talking about, and it's already sort of being distributed in various forms, we want to. Bring it to people's attention as something that is a conversation out there after we've at least done some diligence to try to figure out what we know about it.
So let me pose a question that sort of picks up on that for you as the public editor of a paper or a publishing organization. We're at an event, let's say one like this, that's being live tweeted and a webcast. What if, and you're covering it, what if Jane, who's a well-known exaggerationist, makes a wild allegation about somebody, and this is a case that actually I was privy to, and says there's actually a coach who's molesting children at this university. And the school is covering it up, and the coach is an active coach right now. And a reporter came up to me afterwards and said, "What am I supposed to do with that? Do I report that? Not report that? What's the responsibility? How do you live up to a notion of being accurate, or having fidelity to being truthful and presenting yourself as a good person, even in John's lexicon?"
Well, I think in this case you're really talking about a legal issue more than a moral issue, because you're talking about someone's reputation. Now, because it was said in a public place, do you have, I don't know, I would be coming back and asking you a lot of questions as the editor, and here I'm being the assigning editor and say, well, did Jane name the person? Is it known who this person is? Because we can't name a person without contacting the police, the school, whoever it is. Was it a general allegation that there is someone at the school? So you treat it differently. You always, you put your journalistic hat on, your critical thinking hat, and you say a lot of things. So how important is this story? Is this just, no offense to Jane, just Jane throwing out gossip that really doesn't impact something? So you respond differently to, is this an allegation about the president of the university or someone in authority? So you have to ask all these questions. You have to think about it. And at the end of the day, you have to be able to tell the world what you did and why, which is why it's so important to think about how you're chasing a story. And what you've done is you have to be able to explain what you did.
And if I could make a quick point about trafficking and gossip and unverified rumor, one thing that I always try to remind people, when there was a Orthodox Jewish gentleman who was gunned down in Brooklyn a couple months ago, and it was a big story in New York. And if you go back and look at the New York Times' coverage of it, the Times story about this murder presented rumors as rumor about why it happened. It was literally like, there are many rumors about why he may have been in the Orthodox community, about what it may have been this business deal. I mean, they just presented completely unverified rumor as rumor in a news story, which I'm in favor of. But it's important to remember that the sort of avatars of ethical and responsible journalism are doing that too when you talk about the swamp of online journalism. And another case in the New York Times is when in their coverage of the Malaysian disappeared plane, there are stories where they've just quoted anonymous airplane bloggers and comments on anonymous airplane blogs, just like quoting in the New York Times in a news piece theories about what may have happened from someone they have no idea who it is. It could be a 9-year-old kid. And they just put that in the paper. Again, there are good reasons for that, but it's important to remember that these kinds of decisions are being made at those establishment institutions as well as at little websites.
I'm going to include Jane, but we got to let Ed.
No, I'll wait.
Okay. So Jane, in the research you've done, it seems to me that the consistent sort of pattern is that people glommed onto routines and had a fidelity to these practices which could come and go when the larger principle was sort of the thing that is more enduring. John just talked about sort of the avatars of responsibility. I probably fall into that.
I used to call you when I was a reporter to ask you if certain things were responsible or not.
So, is responsibility, is that gone? Or do you have responsibilities and you live up to them in different ways? Or what does that word, as you've thought about it and listened to all these people talk over the years?
Oh, no, absolutely. I don't think responsibility is gone. And I think just come back to the other discussion. I think there's a difference between honesty and accuracy. I think we're tending to conflate those terms, and they're not the same thing. You can honestly report what somebody said, but is it more broadly accurate? May or may not be the case, and that's kind of what we're getting at. But journalists do. All of us, all of the professors. We learn how to do something, and we're comfortable in that routine. And when something else comes along, and that it's going to challenge that routine, we don't want to admit that we just really don't want to get out of our safety zone, so we find another reason why this thing may need to be resisted, and I think we tend to fall back on ethics in doing that. But no, I very much think responsibility is vital. I think Sylvia's made this point really well. You have to be responsible for what you do. That is part of what. That is part of why people are going to come to you, and not just and why they're going to keep coming to you. But kind of part of what your value continues to be is that responsibility. I think kind of an interesting thing about that we're seeing on the internet and social media and these different formats as they emerge is that actually that responsibility is becoming more nuanced. We're finding new ways or more explicit ways to be responsible. I think when we're talking about accountability and transparency, that's really what we're talking about. Being responsible when all there was the newspaper was maybe a little bit more within our own control to be responsible or not, and no one might necessarily be the wiser. And we started out with Walter Cronkite. In kind of that era, and now we have an environment where being responsible has to be very explicitly articulated, and I think we are seeing journalists do that, and I think that's a positive thing.
Okay, so let me just pick up. Jim Bancroft in his presentation this morning talked about we've entered a phase where a sophisticated quality brand is actually interested in what the audience understands, not just the content you put out, but how citizens in the end, what their comprehension is. Is that what you're responsible to? That people, it's not just. If you pass along things that you don't know are true or not, how do you maintain a responsibility to people understanding it well, or having an accurate understanding, or is that even possible?
Well, the tools we have now enable the media to get a much better bead on what people are perceiving, what they're hearing, and what they're understanding than ever before. This is not something that the media have ever been indifferent to. The notion that they went blithely along without any concern about their audiences is a complete fiction. At the time, I was a journalist starting in the early 1970s, and news organizations were desperately eager to get as close as possible to their readers and know what they were doing and anticipate their wants. So this gives them tools to do that better. I want to come around to a larger kind of this question having to do with the assault on, the questioning of ethics and the importance of ethics to the media and to journalism. And let me just suggest that the future of journalism, the future of the press, and I like that Jay Rosen continues to use that archaic term because it sums up the kind of institutional role that the media were expected to have in this society. Their future depends very much on the embrace of a body of ethical norms. The respect they have from the audience, the respect they get from the courts, the deference they get from government, all depends on the perception that there's a seriousness of purpose about journalism, that is a part of a civic mission to unearth significant realities and bring them to bear to enable a self-governing polity to vote in meaningful ways and take part in civic life. This is a really serious, high-level stuff. And time and again, you see the courts deferring to the press because they trust the press to try to do it right, to take pains to do it right, to have an absolutely important civic mission. Now, the embodiment of that mission has to do with this conversation about ethics, about right and wrong. It's not just the blind application of foolish rules. It's not just deference to the law. And one of the problems in the current age is the institutions of the press are so weak, they're unable to stand up to and defy the law in instances when they should be defying the law. So I think we do ourselves a disservice, and in some ways we imperil the press by being a little dismissive of the notion of ethics as an important area of intellectual elaboration, of moral logic, and of thinking about what professional purpose ought to be. And while we embrace these tools, and Jane's catalog of resistance to technological change was very interesting, but let's remember, by and large, the technologists have taken over. By and large, they have won that argument. The people you're looking at now and the quotes that we are seeing seem like the utterances of dinosaurs on their way out looking at the comet coming down. So it's not as if the technologists are beating a hasty retreat. They won. Now the question is, what have they won and what are they doing with it? And we're arguing in a sort of bashful way that one of the things they should do is reanimate and reaffirm the kinds of ethics that have given the media an important role in the governing of the society.
So I want to go to the audience.
Could I just respond to that real quick?
Yeah.
I take the point about the civic role that reporting on matters of public concern plays. I think when we talk about the deference that has been shown by the courts and the government to the press, I see it actually enacted the other way. The deference that the press has shown, and in many ways the institutional press has shown to the government. And so, one of the things about polite establishment responsible journalism is that when someone goes to Jim Risen at the New York Times and says, George Bush is violating the Constitution with an illegal surveillance program. The New York Times politely and responsibly sat on that story for a year. The ethical consideration that I would consider there, if I were in that place, would be the ethical consideration to the source who risked career and life, or not life, but career and criminal penalties to get that story to light. And so I would caution against trying to reanimate a sense of the primacy of a responsible establishment that's in good favor with the federal government and institutions of law, and I'd rather have a press that's aggressively combating the mistakes of those governments make.
I do want to get to the audience because they've been sitting and listening. But I will. Well, let me just say one thing about this. First of all, Jim's an old friend of mine, and is not deferential to anyone. And part of what happens in a dynamic press is that you have the reporters who find things out, and then they operate within institutions that will or will not accommodate them. But it's not institutions that, in the end, are policing society on behalf of fellow citizens. It's actually these crazed missionary-type people who, whatever you call them, want to create accountability. And Jim's just the perfect example of that. He would be doing this if no one employed him. And he'd be wandering around coming to people and saying, "I've just discovered some amazing thing that you've got
I'm
to
not
figure
blaming
out."
it on him. No. I'm just saying that. I mean, my understanding is that it was that he forced the issue with the book, and that's why it went in the paper.
Right, but the man is still there many years later at the New York Times.
I'm not suggesting that institutions don't often behave in cowardly ways, and Gannett did in connection with Chiquita, and I think the Times has behaved in an acceptable way toward Risen. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not defending cowardly and deferential and pusillanimous institutions. I'm saying that without some underlying seriousness of purpose, you've got a problem. We've got a problem with the standing of the press and the ability of the media to do its job.
Okay, I want to go to the audience. We're going to go over here. I can't, it's a little hard to see who's got a question. I will just say this, that even in an open economic system like we have here, an institution is a brand, and a person is a brand, and how responsible you are in the way you behave is part of whether people, I think, gravitate to you. That I don't think has gone away, and that's part of the dynamics of all of this.
My name is Anohita, and I work with a magazine reporting on South Asia. And in our region, I think we're now going through some of the changes which all of you have probably already been through. So this has been really interesting. I want to go to something which Jane the exaggerator, was talking about confusing cause and effect, and the fact that it's lack of resources and not the technology that is driving a lot of the problems that are seen. But do you think the digital technology and its economics is by itself skewing the economics of responsible journalism? Because of course, if you had 20 more people in the newsroom to verify facts on time, or if your reporter was able to spend more time of a story while other reporters came back and updated every hour or so, it would be different, but that's obviously not so. So I was wondering whether you or somebody else could respond to that.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I actually was in some ways quoting Tom and some of the State of the Media reports, which for a while have been highlighting the economic drivers of some of the problems. But I mean, technology exacerbates the economic problems for media organizations in a whole lot of ways, as we know. So yes, it is certainly a factor. I think though that what we're doing though is we're starting out by looking at the problems that are going to be caused by the technology, and whether that's through individuals using the technology or whether that's what the technology is going to do to us in the newsroom. And then when we actually get into using it, we find ways, as we've seen with social media, to actually articulate our ethics and in some ways even strengthen our ethical practices in ways that it takes us a while to get to, that we would maybe be farther along if we got to those ways a little quicker, as opposed to our starting point being seeing the challenges that are going to be posed. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but certainly technology does raise a whole host of different kinds of issues that do have to be dealt with.
Anybody feel compelling need to jump to add in, or can we get to the next question? Dr. Rosen?
Thanks. Well, congratulations on the best ethics panel I've ever actually listened to. It really was. And I think it's due to the way that you approached it. So this isn't really a question, it's more of an observation that I think connects what we heard. I love Jane's way of phrasing the problem. It seems to me what you were saying, Jane, is people use ethical discussions and questions to flee their anxieties. And that's the way I've always looked at journalism ethics. I rarely participate in discussions of ethics because I find them so boring and arid. And part of the reason is that we never get to what journalism ethics actually is. And I think this panel, you did that. It is actually a way for journalists to flee their anxieties. The other thing I think it is it's a way to control the conversation about journalism. This is what John was getting at. As you know, journalism among learned professions has a unique problem in controlling who gets to be a journalist. In the law, you can have a law license. You can have a medical license. Civil engineers don't sit around thinking about how are we going to prevent all these people from running around claiming to be civil engineers. But in journalism, it's impossible to actually divide non-journalists from journalists. It's impossible to say you don't have the right to publish that. Journalists themselves believe that there shouldn't really be regulations on who should be a journalist. They believe that, but on the other side, they believe these phony people aren't real journalists. And so since that contradiction has to be kind of like under the surface, it comes out through these phony ethics discussions that bore everybody to tears. So it's not a question, that's just my observation. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I would say, and I think journalists agree that there, at least in the United States, that there shouldn't be laws about who should be a journalist, but I think that's how they use ethics. I don't think it's only about anxiety. I do think that there's a very deep-seated belief among most practitioners that ethics do matter, but I do think that they couch their anxiety in sort of an ethical coding, if that makes sense.
I'm going to go ahead.
I like what Jay had to say, but I have to push back against the idea that ethics is somehow a pathology and a response to an illness, and somehow it's the handmaiden of control. Maybe regulation, self-regulation by a group of people that wants to be engaged in a common purpose. There's nothing wrong with self-regulation. There are going to be some behaviors that lie outside of what the relevant group considers acceptable and socially useful. And I think that conversation is a good one to have. So,
yeah, and I would just add that, violating my role here as the moderator, that ethics is in any profession is not just exclusionary, it's also aspirational. It's a way of communicating to your public that you have obligations that are larger than making money. And in a commercial context, yeah, sure, it's a way for doctors to make sure that quacks aren't out there too. And in a moment of disruption, that may kick in. But the idea that somehow you aspire to do things well, I don't think is entirely about commercial exclusion. My own view. Yeah, where are we?
Over there.
So I'm Paula Poindexter, and I'm on the faculty here at University of Texas School of Journalism. I'm also the president of AJMC. And so I want to push back a little bit, too. And in fact, Jane is on the board of directors for AJMC, which is the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. Very, very long name for those of you who don't know who we are. But, you know, the idea that ethics does not mean anything, we really need to correct that. I mean, we have a lot of journalism students who are in the audience, and yes, ethics matter. And if we didn't do a good job, and I suspect that we don't do as good a job as we should be doing, you know, teaching our students ethics, then what would you end up getting by the time they got into the profession? And so ethics matter. I think that we need to emphasize it more and more and more, not only for our students, but also in the profession. Because if we don't have ethics, we certainly don't have a requirement that you have to have a journalism degree. We don't have a requirement that you have licensing or any of those things that go along with professions and so forth. So we need to have something, and so at least let's have some ethics going on here.
So maybe it's not a way of determining who's a journalist and who's not, but it may be a way of determining who's a good one and who's not.
I certainly agree that ethics matter. What I want to push back against is the notion that there should be a professional superstructure on top of this job, that of rigid rules that you have to live by if you're in the club. I think any good reporter and editor can navigate the ethical questions that come up and confront them in a professional environment by simply, you know, don't lie, honor your commitments. I think that, you know, and this is exactly what sort of Ed was talking about, like in terms of making sure that what we're doing has social utility and is responsible. I mean, it's you know, this sort of self-policing. It's sort of a guild-like structure, and that guild has in the past been used to sort of in a sclerotic way exclude people from conversations and delegitimize voices that didn't come from, and I'm not saying that Ed wants that, I'm just saying that attitude has been adopted by people in order to exclude certain voices. And I think it's important to try to think about this job, and I consider it a job, not a profession, in a way that allows a multiplicity of voices, that allows people to bring information and data and views to the table, even if they're not a part of a club of like-minded people who all agree on a shared set of values.
Yeah, so just very briefly, I agree that ethics matter. Ethics are important. It's important for your readers, the relationship with your readers, to know what your standards are. And on the front page of our homepage is our public code of conduct. Now, just to give you one example, one of the things says you should represent yourself as a journalist and tell people who you're working for at the start of the interview. Now, that has an exception to it. So that is the general guideline. The exception is if you're going undercover, if you're doing something that's of such importance that your senior managers have signed off on this, they accept it, and they are willing then to say, in this story, the reporter went out undercover because of this greater good. So that gets to the point of, we're not here just to write gossip and do other things. We are here, there's a real point of greater good here, that we are making society more knowledgeable, more aware of what's going on, and that's our ultimate job.
I feel an ethical obligation to get one more question in.
Hi. My name is Sarah Peralta, and I'm a recent graduate from Texas State University. Currently, I do work in PR, and so I kind of had a thought. Obviously, journalism does not happen in a vacuum, and especially with the evolution of digital journalism with things like native advertising. So what are some considerations of ethics when you're talking in regards to public relations? Does public relations have an obligation regarding ethics in journalism and in advertising?
Great question.
I don't want to say anything.
Are you
going to
make the moderator answer this? Come on.
Well, I would come back to transparency. I mean, I think actually an ethical problem that journalists have had for a long time is that they have not been transparent about when they're using material that's originated from public relations or other places that have not just involved their own reporting. So I would say transparency is going to be the key issue there, as well as in many other places. And I just want to clarify, I am not saying that ethics is not important for any students or anyone else. Not at all what I was saying. What I was saying is that we tend to use it. We tend to misuse our articulation of it. Not that it's not important. Of course it is.
Yeah, just the one comment I would make about PR ethics, and what makes PR ethics so much more perplexing than journalism ethics, in my view, is that you have client obligations. You have clear client obligations, and looking out for the well-being of your client comes into collision frequently with your obligation as a public communicator to tell the truth. And that's the terrain in which PR ethical dilemmas are situated largely consists of that. It's very hard. So I'll just leave you with that. It's a different realm from ours, but nonetheless a perplexing one.
And I'm going to use this as a way to close and segue back to Rosenstiel, which is that I think that we could think of journalism now as a form of public communication, as a form of public storytelling. And journalists are distinguished perhaps because their obligation is to an accurate understanding to the citizen. Their chief obligation is to the citizen, and that the citizen understands things correctly or as accurately as. In public relations, you also have you're also in public communication, public storytelling. Your allegiances are a little different, but the more that journalists can talk about what is ethical storytelling, the more that elevates all public communication, I think. And that may be ethics not as an exclusionary concept, but as an elevating concept where we all win then in a kind of networked system.